Hey, a little less conversation, a little more action, please. All this.
I do, but I guess I can't really use them. Hold on.
Okay, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carl Fudge. I'm a first-year MBA at MIT Sloan and the panel lead for Better, Stronger, Faster Technology Analytics. It's my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists today. Starting to my right, a professional Ironman triathlete, Jordan Rapp. From the law firm Ropes & Gray, who is also a panel sponsor for this panel, David McIntosh. From Under Armour, Tori Hanna. From TaylorMade Golf, Benoit Vincent. From MIT, Pekko Hosoi. And our moderator is Mark McCluskey from Wired.com. The panel will go until 3:20 p.m., and we'll save the last 50 minutes or so for some Q&A from the audience. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so via Twitter with Q, followed by your question, followed by hashtag SSAC13, and then hashtag 205. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you for coming, everybody. I'm excited about this conversation. All day so far, I've been listening to and talking about numbers, and we're going to talk about stuff for a while because it seems like a nice change. And oddly, I'd like to talk about swimming. So swimming had a huge, huge problem a couple of years ago where every world record in the swimming world was destroyed because of swimsuits and not athletes. And so Pekko is actually, amongst other things, a specialist in fluid dynamics. Can you explain a little bit just the science of actually what was happening with the fast suits?
Yeah, so the suits were originally designed to try to reduce drag on the athlete's body. The reason they were actually banned, though, is not because they were so effective at reducing drag, it's because they were buoyant. So they were made out of a neoprene rubber, which gave the athletes a little bit of extra flotation. And so extra flotation helps you in two ways. One is you'd have to expend less energy holding yourself up, so you can put more energy going forward. And the second is that if you're sitting higher in the water, then there's less drag because more of you is in contact with air rather than with water. So again, you can go faster. So interestingly enough, even though I think it was originally motivated by reducing drag, the reason they were ultimately banned was because of the choice of material, which had the side effect of being buoyant.
Right. And what's interesting to me about the situation is that you ran into a problem of trying to understand what a sport was about, what we were actually trying to accomplish through sports, and we get really philosophical really fast with this, but I'm interested in everybody's thoughts on that interaction between technology and equipment on one hand and our ability to keep making things that improve performance in really in small ways to hugely significant ways like swimming found, and the whole point of sports in theory, which is to test something about a physical body and person. So, I mean, anybody who wants to jump in on that, I'd love to hear.
Well, the problem is certainly not new, right? I mean, if you can look back in baseball, when did they ban the corked bat, and when did hockey decide that you could only curve your stick a certain way? And where people come out, I think, as you say, depended on the event. You know, what is it? Does the technological advantage change the nature of the sport? I mean, golf has a history of technological advantage. It's definitely the equipment, the technological evolution of equipment in golf is part of the sport. But yet there are limits, as you know well. And so I think, what are you testing, and maybe how fast of a jump is there? Because certainly the jump from a hickory shaft to a metal shaft was a dramatic one, but one that was okay because it didn't change the nature of the game that much, I suppose. But it's an old question, and it's not new.
But I would also say that I think it's a question that's becoming more complicated with sort of the advent of advances in medical technologies, right? Because now it's not just advances in the equipment, it's actually advances in the athlete, right? So there's things like Tommy John surgery. So this audience is probably familiar with this, but there's a ligament in your arm which can be damaged through overuse in baseball pitching. And it used to be that was a career-ending injury. And that's no longer the case. You can take out that ligament, replace it with a tendon, and then people can pitch just as hard and just as fast as they could before.
And even potentially faster. I mean, there's actually been some research that people actually come back throwing harder after Tommy John surgery.
Exactly. So, and that's, I think, where the big problem lies, because when people hear that, then parents start bringing their high school kids into doctors and demanding Tommy John surgery so that they can become major league pitchers. Now, okay, you're not putting anything artificial in there. It's a tendon from your own body. So is that okay or is that not okay? And I think it becomes very complicated.
I mean, you mentioned golf. I mean, Benoit, as you have an artificially constrained set of rules under which you operate. You can't make a club that does anything you want it to, right? Can you sort of explain how you operate in that kind of environment?
Yeah, the way our sport is set up is there is an organization called the USGA, and they are in New Jersey, and what they do is they set a couple of rules and say you cannot be longer than certain lengths for the golf clubs, cannot be bigger. So there's certain of basic rule we have to observe, but most of those rules are on the driver, believe it or not. It's not on the other clubs. They're trying to limit how long can you drive the golf ball. And there is a very interesting example, as you were talking about the progress. I mean, think about that. Back in 1990 or today, in 2 decades, the average distance on drive has increased by 25 yards. The good news is about when I started in golf in 1990, so I may take some credit for that. But what happened is that was a problem for the USGA, because they say, hey, what are we going to do? Are we going to let all athletes go infinite distance and obsolete all the golf course, and now we have to lengthen all the golf courses? So there's a huge, huge problem about that. And the solution was, hey, we're going to limit certain things in order to plateau or to reduce that growth over time, that fast growth we observed the last 20 years. So, but in my view, which I'm on the side of making golf equipment that is producing more distance, my view is we're limited physically. No matter what, at some point of time, we cannot go further because the laws of physics are here and will be. And there's a beautiful example of the phase flexibility of drivers. They were rigid back before 2000, so you lose. I mean, you could transmit only 78% of your energy to the golf ball, and then we figured out a way to transmit 86% of the energy back in the 2000 years. And the USGA came and said, stop, 83 is the maximum we're going to give you. But here's the caveat, the maximum possibility is 91. Physically, we cannot go more than 91. And even when there was a period of time we could try to investigate how to go, we never figured out a way to go from 86 to 91. It may have taken 10, 20, 30 years. So what? We would have added 20 more yards. Is it what's going to really kill the game? And so what I'm just saying is I think equipment is, no matter what, limited by physics. At some point of time, it'll regulate it itself. So why putting so many regulations unless you really, I mean, you cannot put explosive and powder, you cannot add energy. But why not making as the best as you can?
I do think, though, that you run into, like with some of this technology, that certain athletes are better able to take advantage of it. And swimming is a great example, that you had Paul Biedermann from Germany, who was a good, I mean, you know, within the realm of swimming, he was a good athlete. And then he decimates this world record set by Ian Thorpe, who was sort of, you know, this next level. And you could say that Biedermann benefited from the suits more than another athlete. And so I think that you start to say, like, I think where does the technology, there's certain athletes for their physiology, their body type, whatever you could say, you know, maybe without the suit, Biedermann was a dense swimmer, right? So he would have sunk more, so he benefited more from buoyancy than a guy like Michael Phelps maybe. And I think you look at that, and I think that, so if certain athletes are benefiting more, then how does that make it equal? And I think it's certainly the can of worms, you know, Oscar Pistorius, where they say, you know, they roughly say that he was probably a 52-second 400-meter runner, but with no, you know, with the prosthetics, he was a 46. So how long is it before some guy cuts off his own legs to become a 40? I mean, and people look at you like you're crazy, and you think, well, like, you know, there's the panel on doping. It's like, it's only a matter of time before somebody does it. And I think that's going to be, how do we set this? Because there is so much inequality. At the same time, how do you address something? You say, well, that's such an inequality, but then how do you address the inequality of some guy that grows up, in an affluent family, in the first world versus somebody who's a, child of a single parent in the third world, right? Like, so there's so much inherent inequality that at some level it is so arbitrary.
Well, even down to, just there's inequality between our physiologies, right? I could train as hard as you do. Actually I couldn't, but imagine that I did. That outcome's not going to be the same. There are sort of baseline physiological things about us that are different, and we're sort of comfortable with sports as a measuring stick for some of those things that are sort of inherently unequal. But then with the overlay of technology and equipment and doping you mentioned, we lose a little bit of that sense of like where all those arbitrary lines get drawn.
Like we seem, as a society, we seem to differentiate between those things that overcome disadvantage, that like, having no legs, like needing a golf cart to participate in a golf tournament. Casey Martin, yeah. We seem to feel different about those types of things, having Tommy John surgery, than things that are done to take, a normal, quote, normal person and improve. Like, so what's the difference between contact lenses that a baseball player uses to correct, eyesight that's less than 20/20 to some sort of special lens he puts in to enable him to see the ball better when he already has 20/20? Do we feel differently? And what about a pill that would give him better eyesight to hit a ball? I think we feel differently about those things because some are kind of correcting what we all see are things in life people have to correct, while others, are trying to enhance kind of your God-given athletic ability. We all can't be 6'10".
We know fairness when we see it.
Right, yeah.
Well, and I just think too, the platform, like obviously with the swimsuits and everything, that happened on the Olympic stage. And so it created so much attention and created so much conversation around it, where some of these other, performance, whether equipment, improved equipment and stuff, hasn't happened on that grand of a stage. So, whether it's the contact lenses or, various things and stuff, I just think it's one of those things where it also depends on the stage in terms of how much media attention and how much conversation it's going to be, to the point that something gets banned or is considered unfair or whatever else. So,
how much? We've got an interesting mix of sort of like research scientists and manufacturers and athletes up here. That's kind of the pathway for a lot of this innovation, that you get a lot of very sort of like lab science work and a lot of material science work that gets translated into an applied way and then funnels down to the athletes. So I'm curious to hear sort of in that order, how that process tends to work in terms of innovation.
Do you want to start on lab science?
Let's start with lab science. We could go backwards.
Well, okay, so I think one of the problems in the system right now is that in the laboratory, we're very divorced from the athletes. He's all the way over there. No idea what he wants, right? So, and I think that's something that's changing, that we're starting to interact more with the final consumer, with the manufacturers, trying to figure out, what are the long tent poles, right? What do we need to be tackling? A lot of times if you're in an academic lab, you're focusing on very fundamental things like developing new materials, maybe developing designs which will give you some mechanical advantage, but oftentimes those don't go all the way to a final product, and you need to find some partnership in order to get to a real product, I would say.
And so from the sort of equipment side, how do you guys develop those partnerships? Because you're sort of the bridge between that fundamental research and the...
At Under Armour, our mission's about making athletes better, and so, this panel's a little, but we're constantly, every single day, we're in touch with our athletes, we're in touch with our teams, and just understanding, one, how our current products are helping them and benefiting them, and then two, what are those things out there that can continue to make them better. And, I don't think 15 years ago, 17 years ago, no one was sitting there like, you should come up with a compression shirt because that's going to make people cooler. And so it's that sort of mentality and that sort of mission that we've taken on, is really just kind of integrating with the athlete and making them a part of our everyday life.
So what's an example of the sort of feedback or request that you might get from a team or a coach or an athlete?
Everything from, our first 4 product lines were actually built off of athletes' feedback. So Kevin Plank originally came out with a compression shirt, and then after speaking with athletes, after speaking with teams, he realized like, hey, this is great for, kind of normal climates or warmer weather, but we need a material that's going to be out there that is for cold weather. And how do you keep the athlete cool? How do you keep them warmer in the cold atmospheres like Green Bay? So one of the great stories is he goes down to the Atlanta Falcons. They love the product, the heat gear product that we had out there. They were going up to play the Green Bay Packers, and they needed a shirt that was going to keep them warm in the cold weather. And so Kevin goes up to New York Garment District, goes and finds this fabric that's going to work. It's still going to be lightweight, it's still going to be moisture wicking, but it's going to keep that athlete drier, and it's going to keep them warmer in that colder climate. And so that's how our product lines developed over the years. It's just listening to that athlete, listening to what their needs are, and making those small tweaks. So, and now, we're rolling out this performance monitor now called Armor 39, and that's just simply creating awareness for the athlete that they wouldn't have otherwise. How hard are they working in a workout? And then how do they use that information to make them train smarter in years to come?
Okay, I want to get back to the sort of real-time metrics stuff later, because I think that's a really fascinating thing. Benoit, what Tori just described was a fairly elite-driven model, like sort of teams and people with that contact. You have the challenge of designing gear that goes to the most elite golfers in the world and also to people who are as bad as I am. And so how does that design process start? Does it start looking at the elite? Does it start trying to make 13 handicap better? I mean, how does that?
Actually, we start with the top of the pyramid. If the performance is embraced by the best athlete in the world, usually it helps also every one of us. What's really interesting is we have aspiration because we're just in the lab, we're mechanical engineers, we're scientists, we know how to improve performance, like on paper, or let's make sure that the golf ball is going to fly further regardless, for example, its spin level. Golf ball fall out of the sky if it's below 1,000 RPM on a drive, it flies if it's above 2,000. I dream to have golf ball flying forever, even if it's 500 RPM of spin. So my point is we have dreams as scientists. The problem is how do we get there, and which one is the one that is the most appealing for those athletes. And that's why I think there is a free market of ideas. We all go, not only we listen to them, but also we provide them different solutions, and we see how they choose and elect some. They drop some of the ideas. An example is forgiveness versus power. Which one do you give? I mean, you do triathlon. Do you put your wheels on your bike? Do you put your cover wheels, your plain wheels, or do you use empty wheels? Which one are you going to use during that race, knowing that if you have wind, I maybe penalize you if you have... How do you make those choices? We have to listen to the player, because years by years, they're going to choose and select and filter what's really important for their game.
And I think
don't know which one to use.
every athlete's different too in that matter of like something that works for one isn't necessarily going to work for the other. So it's also giving that kind of variety and that array in the products that will, target in on the different needs.
So taking it sort of at the end of the process, Jordan, when when you talk to Specialized, for instance, I mean, how are you interacting with a company that's building your $12,000 tri-bike so that it's meeting your needs and giving you what you need for your best performance?
I think it can be a tough balance sometimes, that I think sometimes you end up using stuff in ways that are unexpected for a company, where they'll say, we designed it to be used like this. And you're like, well, I use that, but I don't use it anything like that. Mm-hmm. There's a interesting company that I work with called Normatec, and they make basically these compression boots, the air compression boots. You see a lot of NBA players. And they started as a company like rehab guys would go in for knee surgery, and then they started using these, and then they just kept wearing them, even though it was like, well, you shouldn't need to use that. They're like, oh, but I feel better when I use it. And so now people, you know, use it for just sort of general recovery. And I think that's a great example of, you know, a company where it's like, well, I know what you're telling me this product is for, but this is how I use it. You know, or some of the things where they think this is, you know, it's incredibly important that a wheel does this. And I'm like, well, actually, I don't care about that. I care about this other thing. You know, like one of the newest wheels have from Zip is a big composites manufacturer. Like they focused entirely on not making the wheel any faster, but it's a wheel that's easier to handle in crosswinds. So it's basically the same speed, but it's less sort of physically demanding. You know, and the idea was it's great if something is really, you know, like they had this one wheel that I rode for a long time, but it was quite a handful. And you think, okay, I have to make this decision. Is this too much, or is it like, do I give up the speed? You know, because how do I quantify? I can quantify the speed, but how do I quantify like the fatigue it takes to handle that wheel? And so that can be a challenge to sort of say, I want something that does. I know that you think I want this, but I'm telling you that I want this. You know, and sometimes you find a way to use something that they make in a different way, and sometimes, you know, you have a way that. And then certainly I think getting to the idea of Tory, like Specialized made a new bike, and there was a bunch of us, and I was in one of the early meetings when we're sort of what do athletes want, and there were 5 of us there, and we all wanted something different. And it was sort of like, well, okay, how are they gonna split these hairs, right? And there's things about like the bike that I have that I don't have that I wanted, and then there's other features that somebody else wanted that like I didn't want but I now use. And so I think that, you know, that it's a hard balance, and I think you have to be willing to sort of take a flyer on some other idea, and then you hopefully can find a company that's willing to listen to what you say, even if it's something like, you know what, I know why you did that, but I think that was a great idea, but that's not actually how I think it works, and this is why I use it and why I think I do like it or I don't like it, you know. And I think that hopefully you find a company that's receptive to that, and when you do, you know, I think those are the companies that really take off.
There's this spectrum, at least in my head, we'll see if you guys agree, of sports, the sort of most to least equipment dependent. And I guess I put running at one end of that spectrum, right? You run. And we can talk about footwear. And at the other end, I put Formula One, that is basically a competition about equipment, except that you have a driver. And a really good driver. So can a good driver take an okay car to a championship? Is there something, do we even need to worry about the fact that there's such a broad range? Is that part of actually the appeal of sport, is that there's just such a spectrum in different ways and that we just sort of know how to deal with that? Or is there something, I guess I'm trying to get towards like the creeping Formula One-ism of all sports and how we should feel about that.
Well, I mean, I think the spectrum is good. I mean, I think that's how you appeal to a broad range of people, right? There are people who really love all the nitty-gritty of Formula One, and there are people who just want to throw on a pair of running shoes. But having said that, there's a lot of tech in running shoes. You know, I mean, so when we talk to companies who are interested in developing new technologies, running shoe companies are right at the top of that list. I mean, there are new manufacturing techniques, new materials, new rubbers, new fabric. I mean, so I'm not sure if I would put running down at that end, but I think the spectrum is a good thing. I think everybody can sort of find the place that they're most comfortable with then.
For some sports, speaking as an amateur participant, the equipment is part of the fun, right? Golf, the equipment is definitely part of the fun, like the shiny new driver at Christmas or something like that. And skiing is another one where the equipment is part of the fun. And so I think I agree with that's just part of the gestalt of some sports that make them great.
I'm wondering how much, even if they both start with an S, sport and science, if we're not confused sometimes to think that sports is a science lab. I mean, I hear some of those conversations that are happening here where we think that we want to compare the data for 100 years. And there is an underlying hypothesis here that things are going to stay constant, but the human performance. I say, if that's the picture of sports, if all what we're here is to try to extract the performance of a human being, I don't know. I mean, that feels to me like a lab situation. It's not sport. Sport is it's a game. I mean, there's way much more to sports. So equipment is a part of it, the environment. I mean, a lot of things. Hey, what about the fans that are, in golf, they're all silent, but under some other sport, they're pretty loud. So what about that piece of the environment? I think, so even if we use scientific tool in sports, if we use equipment to enhance the performance, I still think that sports is way larger than just a science lab project.
Yeah, well, I agree, and I agree also with what you said earlier, that, I think athletes, professional athletes are operating right at the edge of physical and mental abilities, and when you're walking that hairy line, I don't think you want to be held back or limited by your equipment. I think get as much help as you can.
But yet some games are history is very much a part of baseball in particular, I think of, where the statistics are very important for the fan in comparing past players. So I think it too varies,
That's true.
I do think, though, that there's a sense, and it's quite funny, big races, and people will talk, and you hear, and it's like, well, yeah, okay, fine, like, I get that, you have this, he doesn't race well on this, and that guy doesn't do it, and it's like, so this is how they're going to finish. It's like, well, we're still going to have the race to find out, because often, that's not actually what happens. And I think, having come to be a professional as someone that, I was not a runner, a swimmer, or a biker. I was a rower in college, sort of fell into the sport, and it's like sometimes you go, especially now with social media, and I think like, if I look at all these workouts that these other athletes do, I'll be like, wow, I'll never beat that guy, and then I do. And I think, well, how did that happen? And I think that's the fun of the race day. And I remember it was a great, friend of mine, one of probably the all-time greats in the sport, Chris McCormick, and like doing this interview, this German guy was sort of favored to win the Ironman World Championships in Hawaii, and the German guy is giving this talk, sort of explaining why Chris will never beat him. And he's like, well, he's like, I don't even know why I show up to race. He's like, but since I'm here, we might as well give it a go. And then, and then Chris ends up winning. And so I think that it's, you can get into that sense of, well, it's all these numbers and it's, all of this, but at the end of the day, there's a whole lot that you can't quantify, and like that's a big part of the fun. I think as long as, all that other stuff is great, but it's still good, I think, to have that sort of the uncertainty of, the race or the game or whatever it is. I think that's what people thrive on, that, whether it's seeing how statistics confirm the outcome or how, the outcome sort of totally disproves, whatever the model or whatever the pundits had been saying.
You talked a little bit about sort of that thing at the start line. I'm curious about sort of how, as an athlete, you integrate, if your equipment is your tool set, right? If I'm a construction worker, I have a hammer I really like, and then it breaks one day and I have to get a new hammer. I mean, how do you make those shifts in equipment, and how do you sort of integrate those into your training and your performance?
So I get sort of a mechanical engineer by training, so I think people a lot will say that like I'm overly focused on equipment, and I think what's interesting is that I think I probably spend almost no time when I'm actually racing thinking about all the equipment, because I've spent that time beforehand. And I think the idea is, once you get into racing, you want to be able to put all that energy into racing, not wondering whether or not, your equipment is going to let you down or be reliable. And so I think, when you're out there, you can say some guy that is maybe, like Tiger Woods with all that stuff with going back and forth on drivers, that, he was so focused on the driver. And it's, I think, as an athlete, when I look at that, I say that's because when he gets out there and he's actually playing, he doesn't want to think about the club. That's why he spends so much time thinking about it in all those other circumstances. And I would say that probably 90% of the equipment falls into that category, where I spend all that time thinking about it when I'm not training, when I'm not racing, so that when I do that, it's just something I know works. And then there's a couple of those things that come along every so often where you can really use them, and they really, I think, are paradigm shifters in how you prepare. I think like the GPS watch has been one of the big ones, that you want to run a marathon at this pace, every second you can see how close you are to that. And that's been a huge, you think that sort of to grow from something like a stopwatch in a track to now being able to run anywhere you want and to just look down and know, I'm on that pace to hit that goal. And then with cycling was the power meter, which was sort of like, I think bringing that kind of F1 style, knowing what your body is putting out in a very real way. And those are the two that more than anything else, I think really changed the way that I train and the way that I race. I use those as sort of guides to what I'm actually doing. But I think everything else is that stuff that you want to think about a lot when you're not doing it, so that when you are doing it, you know that it's just going to work.
And that sort of real-time telemetry for training is obviously a huge frontier, and you were talking earlier about what Under Armour is doing. I mean, how do we build two things? How do we build systems that allow it at a level of granularity that is helpful for athletes, and then how do we translate it so that it's helpful for coaches and athletes? Those seem to me to be the two big questions.
I mean, I think there's going to be a really big learning curve in that as well, in terms of understanding, you know, as you were saying before, Jordan, is the endurance space is just a little bit more in tune with, they're not more knowledgeable about heart rate and understanding the metrics in their sport and everything. And then you've got the team sport side where they haven't really been doing heart rate data or intensity data and that sort of stuff. So I think there's going to be a huge learning curve over the next 5-10 years in just understanding that data and then understanding how do I use this data to benefit the athlete. You know, so I think over the years we're going to see coaches using it in very different ways. European soccer obviously is very advanced in how they're using this data already. I think here in the States we're a little bit further behind in that. And I think sport specific as well. You know, is the intensity data going to be more important than heart rate data, and how hard this guy's training on any given day? What's his recovery rate? And then how does he use that data? Does he end up using that data to rest the next day? Or does he take a day, you know, more of a slower paced day? Or does he drive through one more day and then takes a day off? And I think we're going to find athletes of all sizes, of all sports, of both genders, using it in very different ways. And I think, you know, companies are going to be able to provide, again, just this awareness to them of what is their body actually going through. The equipment is so important from the external standpoint, but we've never really been able to measure the inside of an athlete's body up till this point. So.
How are we going to measure the inside of athletes' bodies?
It's hard. That's easy. Just swallow a thermometer. No, but I think, sorry, this will be fast. I would even go one step beyond giving this data to coaches and athletes, and I'd say just give the data to the equipment. I mean, imagine you're on your bike, you'll have a heart rate monitor, you have a GPS, and your bike tells you, your bike puts it in the right gear and says, go, right? I mean, I think that
automatic shifting from my bike.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we're getting to a things that think era, right? And I think a lot of the equipment that we're building is going to start to have software and sensors built into the hardware.
I just want to say something that's really interesting on the heart rate, for example, or breathing. And I'm thinking that it's good to collect data, but which data are really relevant to the progress in your sport? And this is a difficult problem. I'm going to give you a funny example. In putting, for example, there are studies that show that the guy who is more successful in putting is the guy who is going to putt when he breathes out, not when he breathes in. And to monitor that, to correlate with your heartbeats, you know, and during the one beat, there is a up and down in this beat, and it's in the down of that beat that matters. A normal heart rate monitor system either average 10 beats, or even if he gives you one, it doesn't give you the insight in one. So here is an example where you're measuring a biometric that matters totally differently. You have to monitor it totally differently for one sport than another sport. So it's not just having data that is going to be good. It's which data really are making you perform better, understanding that dynamic. That's going to be complex.
And so whose job is that? Where should we expect? Is it the people in this room? Is it your companies? Is it people in your labs? Is it the athlete? Is it the coach? I mean, we're going to have a level of granularity on real-time athlete performance really, really soon, especially, as you were saying, in team sports, as opposed to we've got some of it in individual endurance sports that we've never seen before. And how do we do what you were just talking about, Benoit? What's the path forward to be like, I don't know, what do we do now? Like,
I do think that you have to be careful, though, where like the lab decides that, like what's correlation and what's causation, right? Is it that these guys are better because they breathe out on their putting, or is it just that is something else? Like, I mean, In endurance, blood lactate was a big thing. That was like everything with lactic acid, all that kind of stuff. And now essentially like all of probably what most, like if you were just to pick somebody who was sort of a runner and the lactic acid burn, like everything that person probably thinks they know is totally wrong, right? And yet, and for the longest time you were told that, you must operate below this and, but, and so that was something that it was correlation, but it wasn't causation, right? That everybody said, well, this is, it's the acid is limiting your muscle's ability to fire, but it wasn't. That was just this correlated byproduct, and it had nothing to do with that. And so I think that's the hard thing, is that sometimes you end up thinking that this is a driver, and it's just sort of, it's correlated, but it's not a cause.
But I mean, I would say that people are going to do this because it's big business. There's big money in this. Like, if you can improve athletic performance, then, I mean, people will pay money for that. So, whether it's people in this room or whether it's us, if somebody is smart enough to figure that out, it'll happen, right?
Or if you can create the perception that you're improving.
Exactly. So that's the question. But the interesting thing about athletics is that there is a measure, right? I mean, if you're winning races, then you improve, right? So
Let's get the right sponsors.
Yeah.
I mean, we can sponsor the right athletes.
And if I take the example, and you're saying, hey, sometimes the measurement is the correct one, and sometimes it's totally incorrect, and it's going to be abandoned naturally, like piece of equipment that don't work, they just go away, it gets filtered, and then the right thing stayed. If I look at this putting thing, hey, we know that when the guy breathes out, he's going to relax. His autonomic system is going to be in certain stage that will give him more concentration. I mean, a lot brain activity is changing on the breathe out versus the breathe in. He's not ready for action. He's ready for relaxation. So what I'm saying is, but scientists, you guys are going to, not us, sorry, we're not good enough, but you guys are going to figure it out, and you're going to train, you're going to let know, and you guys benefit it. That's how we see it. The right things will filter, will be used.
I agree.
But
And I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say to that point is you see a lot of companies bringing the science in, whether it's innovation teams, R&D teams, and everything. So we're really kind of converging everything together now and having it right at our fingertips. And I just think that those resources are going to continue to kind of come down where, athletes are in there, you got the scientists in there, and you have the brand team in there, and everybody's working together to make that athlete better at what they do.
And I think that's happening more and more. Like, so when we started the sports tech program at MIT, I was swamped with students and faculty who want to work with athletes and companies on these types of problems. So I think it's moving in that direction.
I would think the equipment makers have an educational challenge as well, right? If you're rolling out a product like Under Armour 39, you want to educate your potential market as to how to make the best use of it. And so I think that's a big part of that kind of a product launch.
It's a huge part, and I think, to your point, is working with the athletes, and we can say, hey, this is our vision for it, this is how we see you using it, but then actually working with athletes and actually working with teams and really seeing firsthand, like, how are you integrating this into your day-to-day training, how would you integrate it into the game, and then going from there and continuing to build upon it, is the big goal, so.
We've talked briefly at the start about sort of where you draw those arbitrary lines, and since we have Benoit here, I'm just curious to poke at this question a little bit more, and that is, there's a lot of discussion right now in golf specifically about what the horrible word is bifurcation, and that is, should amateurs play by the same rules as professionals? And right now, the proximate cause is about putting, like where you can stick a putter, and can you have a belly putter, or the ones you hold up here. But it also gets to the distance question and how equipment makers are held back because of the physical characteristics of the 50 best golfers in the world and not the 50 million people who might get more enjoyment out of the sport if they could drive the ball more than 200 yards. I mean, is there, not to drag you into the politics of all of this, but are people drawn to the idea of one set of rules and that there's something sort of sacrosanct about that? Or are we more comfortable with this idea that elite athletes aren't actually like us, and why are we sort of like designing for edge cases rather than the broad middle?
It's a terrible question in our field because it's a huge battle around that. It's called descaling the game. But if I look at, I love the triathlon because do you have any rules on equipment?
No, I mean, not very many. Some very basic ones, like that sort of keep people on a relatively, like the big one is you can't ride a recumbent bike because, be twice as fast, right? So,
But they are very minimum.
Yeah.
Talk about the swimsuit. Can you use a buoy to go in the water?
no.
No? Can you use a swimsuit?
Yeah.
And can it be thick?
There's some variation on that, right?
Exactly. So
Like, for example, the big one is bifurcation is, and I don't understand it, is that it's, I can wear a wetsuit up to a certain point and then I have to go to like a swimsuit. And I have to do it in colder water than most people, despite the fact that you think well, you look at all the pros, the one thing we have in common is that we're all really skinny. Shouldn't we be having the higher temperature cut off, right? Rather than you stick us in the 68-degree water in just a bathing suit.
So wait, just so I understand you. So elite athletes have a lower water temperature that they
Right,
have to
so
come. That's
We,
fascinating.
essentially, the water can be colder and we're going to be in a bathing, so there'll be races where I will be in a bathing suit, but an amateur would be in a wetsuit.
Right.
And the wetsuits are clearly faster.
Right, because your body fat is
Right, so that I'm freezing.
Yeah. That's really fun.
But in a sport where there are very limited amount of restriction on equipment, think about it. Does it make a huge difference between the top athlete and the rest of the population? The rest of the population has access to the same equipment as you have. The price barrier, maybe, but maybe if you have enough money, you can buy all the equipment you have, and they don't compete against you. I'm in a camp, of course, I'm on a manufacturing camp. I'm on a camp that equipment is not the problem because we're limited by physics. At some point of time, we can do so much. Even this swimsuit that you were talking at the beginning is, okay, let's have all of them wear the same swimsuit, and we're going to beat certainly the speed, but everybody is going to progress, and that's what happened in golf. They all have a better equipment, and they still compete. At the end of the game, you have a human being that needs to be able to focus, and he has to putt, and within a fraction of a second, he can lose $1 million, make $1 million. And so, but what's going to be the difference? It's at the end of the game, there's a human being with his brain, his heart, his physiology, his training, his confidence, and all of that. So I don't think that equipment remove any of the human performance when it's time to under pressure to win.
I do think, and there's again some arbitrariness. I think with golf, a great example, and I used to talk about this with some friends that were golfers, and I said, if you're playing in just a regular, say, a collegiate tournament, and you lose you slice a drive and you lose the ball, you have a penalty. But you never lose a ball in a major tournament because there's however many thousands of people watching where the ball goes. So it's a pro golfer is always going to find that ball. They may have a lousy lie, but they're never going to have it sort of where it rolls under a leaf and it's hidden and they just can't find it, and so they take a penalty for that. So you think, well, imagine if you had sort of that same kind of, how much better would these players shot some guy who is great at rescuing if he just had people to follow his ball, but he loses 2 or 3 strokes in a tournament because he just doesn't have fans there to watch. So how do you account for that, right? Well, these guys have different rules, but then there's an inherent sort of unfairness of just, well, spectators are there tracking their balls, but when you're out playing yourself, you only got a bunch of squirrels watching your ball.
Yeah, and in theory, you have the handicap system too in golf, right? That's a unique part of the game is that in theory, you already even have a system in place to account for the differences between different golfers. Does that feed into the equipment side at all?
I don't think it solves entirely the bifurcation problem. It solves a lot of problems, but it doesn't solve entirely this problem. And this bifurcation raised another question is, hey, am I going to train with an equipment that is different than the one when I'm going to compete I'm going to use? And that transition is the tough one. So where's the line? I can tell you a lot of amateurs are qualifying for major tournaments, and which equipment they're going to play now. They are used to play a certain sort of equipment. Now they have to play another sort just because they are in a competition in PGA Tour. So it raises a lot of problem to have different rules, and no matter what they play on tour, they play shaft that none of us will play. They play configuration of golf club that it's unplayable by most of us. So no matter what, all the build of the product, even if it's the same, some of the same component, the overall build is totally different than most of us would play. So I don't like to put the problem at the equipment level because I don't think that that's where it lies. I don't think equipment solves the problem in sport, in any sport. I think human being, one more time, performance and human being is way much more important. And that's what I believe also is the most progress to be made. For an equipment manufacturer, that's kind of terrible for me to say that. but I mean, it's the day we go in the mind of the athletes, the day we have biosensors, we go in their mind, their brain, and watch what happened when they have to score. I think that now, rather than have psychologists looking out on a bench side, we should have neuroscience watching the inside of the guy. And now we're going to make dramatic progress. I mean, that's what I believe.
So, wow, that's crazy. So let's talk about that sort of futuristic stuff. I mean, let's put on our crazy dreaming hats and like, where are we going to find ourselves in 10 years with equipment beyond my neuroscience plug in that after every workout I sort of download my serotonin levels to. What are some other, where do you see the frontiers being in this world?
I think it's still going to be, decision making, right? I think you have all of this data, and then what do you actually do with it, right? And I think it'll just sort of change, I think, in a lot of ways, what is, in some ways, intuitive, right now is that, it's sort of, you are making a decision about a way that you feel, and then in the future it might be picking between two numbers. But I still think, ultimately, I think sports is really, is largely sort of, a decision theory kind of thing, that, can I do this? Is this shot worth the, and you can quantify that as much as you want, but I think at some level there's going to be, it can be more and more specific, but at some level there's going to be sort of just an intuitive decision that has to be made, and is that the right one, or is that the wrong one? And then was it even really a right or wrong, or was it just that happened to work out on the day, and then or it didn't happen to work out on the day? So I think that, you get to have where you're making sort of these more and more precise decisions maybe, but it's still a decision that has to be made by somebody that doesn't know how that decision is going to play out in the end. And so I think that, it'll be, bigger, faster, or whatever, and so maybe you have less time to make those decisions. But even something like your sort of extreme example of F1, somebody still has to drive that car and still has to make those decisions like, how tight can I take that corner, in the rain? That sort of stuff that is sort of, that's, I think, what makes sports exciting. And, whether it's something like poker where, it's $1 million on sort of the flip of a card, or whether you think there's a huge amount of uncertainty or a very little amount of uncertainty, as long as there's some uncertainty, I think basically the sport is still the same. As long as you don't know who's going to win before the gun goes off, I think people will be interested.
I think too, just in terms of, from an information standpoint, is pulling out this information, being able to analyze it and everything to help make those decisions. But in that decision-making process is that the athlete's confidence and the ability to make them more confident in their decision-making. Because when it comes down to it, back to your point of, the athletes can use the same equipment and everything else, but it comes down to that mental capability, the sports psychology side. And if you're that much more confident in the decisions that you're making, your effectiveness is going to improve. And so I think, again, this great convergence of science coming in on top of sport is going to, be able to provide this information that we just didn't even think that we could have had 10, 20 years ago.
So, I think talking with some of the sports manufacturers, what everybody wants right now is stronger, lighter, cheaper. So, so we visited Nash, Robbie Nash, who develops windsurfing, kiteboards, surfing. And I said, okay, as a scientist, if I could wave a magic wand and change one material in your production cycle, what would it be? And they didn't even have, everybody immediately went, carbon fiber. Like, what would I change? Carbon fiber. Like, I couldn't even finish the question. And carbon fiber is great, but it's expensive, right? And so stronger, lighter, cheaper may be the biggest one on that list. And I think if you get those materials, so if anybody watches X Games, every year on X Games, somebody is throwing a trick that has never been done before in competition, right? And one of the reasons for that, well, A, a lot of these sports are very new, but B, the equipment is getting stronger and lighter, which means you can go faster, which means you can throw bigger tricks. And so athletes are starting to do incredible things because of advances in materials.
And I think that comes into the apparel as well, apparel and footwear. It's not just, you know, the actual hard equipment that you're using in whatever sport you're in. But, I mean, we've already had amazing advances in just the material that athletes are wearing now. It's a lot cooler, it keeps you a lot warmer, it's so much lighter. And, you know, just thinking down the road, like, what is that? How is it going to continue to advance? How do you embed technology into that equipment? I mean, there's I think 10 years, we're not far from it. We're not far from any of this sort of.
We've got to.
But the more, I mean, the underlying dynamic of what you said is, it's not because it's lighter per lighter, it's because the energy that is deployed by the athlete is consumed by something else than the performance, by the equipment. You lose, you dissipate energy, you're flexing products. I mean, you're dissipating the energy in heat, in deformation, whatever. And, and that's what it is. If it's lighter, you don't have to weigh just to carry it. And so you reduce your strain energy. So really at the end of the game is, hey, how can we make equipment as efficient as we can, which is out of the way of performance? And that's pretty much the theme of most of what you see is, the problem is most of the time when we do that, we injure the player. We make things too rigid, and then we transmit all the energy, but now he's gonna have pain points. So it's this balance of efficiency and respecting the body.
You just made a nice point that it's not just the hard equipment, but it's apparel, but it's also, and this is a question from the crowd, it's also venues and tracks and pools and fields. I mean, where do we see that sort of playing into all these dynamics?
Well, there's already a huge amount of science in the design of a fast pool, right? So pools nowadays are very different than they were last time, and they're designed in features to reduce reflection of waves so that the athletes don't have to fight waves. So, I mean, I think that's already happening, certainly in water sports. I don't know about the others as much.
I mean, even field sports, you talk, like turf fields are continuing to advance, you know, whether it's reducing injury, whether it's, you know, making it a little bit faster. I mean, facility I mean, that's why these, you know, colleges are spending millions of dollars in upgrading their facilities, and there's this like arms race into whose facility is the nicest this year. And I mean, it's a huge, huge benefit for athletes.
Is that something, I mean, could you even see like purpose-built triathlon facilities in the future?
I think, you know, a facility is one of those things that is interesting, because then you have sort of that kind of that arbitrariness of some of the other stuff. Like, you start talking about a race that takes place over a really long time. I think one thing, you know, sort of say, talk about the future of marathon running, and how will, at the Summer Olympics, how will global warming affect performance, you know? And I think that sort of gets into the venue in a different way, where we're engineering it, but sort of, you know, not intentionally. And I think, you know, that's sort of one of those things, again, you know, will we reach a point where all of a sudden marathon time, you know, you start talking, I mean, these very small differences. You look at a race like in Beijing, where it was so hot, and yet, you know, the times were so, you know, were slow, or Athens, where it was also quite warm, you know. And then how are you gonna account for that? And so I think, you know, it'd be interesting to see sort of, as you engineer more of some of these things, and then, you know, but then you have sort of then the uncertainty of the stuff that you can engineer becomes, you know, more significant. You know, an F1 track that is sort of totally self-contained, but then, you know, you end up, the winds, say, on that become so much more impactful, because everything else is so, you know, is so manicured, that I think you make some things more certain, and then these other uncertainties that were sort of glossed over all of a sudden become massively important. I think that's one of the things I think is the most interesting, is to see how once you sort of nail down this one thing, you say, well, that's no longer an issue. All of a sudden, this other thing crops up that was never a problem before, because it now is the defining, you know, variable. Whereas before it was just oh, that doesn't really matter. And so I think that's sort of this interesting thing as you sort of, it's like the game where you hit the gophers, right? And it's like you hit one, and then this other one popping up over here. And I think that's this sort of race where you put all this, we need to make it this, and then you end up with this new problem that you couldn't even conceive of.
I have a student who put up a really nice example of that, which is in swimming. So, when you hit the wall, that's when the clock stops. And so you can time things to within 1/100 of a second or something like that. But if you look at the speed of sound, so when they start the race with the buzzer, the difference between when the first person hears that sound and when the person in lane 8 hears that sound is larger than the difference that they're measuring in the finishing times. Right.
So now they have underneath each
Yeah.
starting block, right? That was a big thing.
Yeah,
It
that
used
was
to
a
be a
big thing
starter
in
gun,
London.
and now
They had,
Under each one,
underneath
right.
each block is a starting horn, right? So like
Right.
that's one of those, I think that's a great example where you saw like, this
Yeah.
was all of a sudden you introduced this disadvantage because the timing was so precise that you then had to figure out how to work around
exactly,
that, and then.
the speed of sound is physics. It
Right.
comes down to physics again.
And then does a swimmer who gets in a lower crouch, right? Like how long before people figure that they get their ear closer to the horn, and then that's the next advantage, right? And so,
But you see, that's for me what's challenging this notion of timeless record. This notion that we have in mind that performance is absolute versus time, which is in 200 years from now, we will be able to compare whoever runs versus the guy who was running 200 before. I mean, I don't think it's realistic. I think it's an utopia, or it's a fantasy to think that we can have a time, at some point in time, a performance, and that's the benchmark. And nothing will change, and we can always compare to that. Just measuring time will change in swimming pools, so guess what? All bets off. I mean, you cannot compare anymore. So, and that's what's fun, no?
It's a popular notion
Sports.
at an analytic statistics conference, right? You can't really make me a full comparison.
Exactly. It's evolving. It's
Another question from the crowd that's sort of interesting, and that is, how do you keep innovations secret and gain a competitive advantage from them? And how do you keep innovation secret and gain a competitive advantage? Let me not try and ask the question a different way.
So, I'll just do one quick comment. So when I visited Nash Design Studio about with surfing, windsurfing, kiteboarding, the expectation is that any innovation you have will be copied, period. And whether it's patented or not patented. And so if you're going to patent something, you should only patent things that you are willing to pay the cost to defend them in court. Otherwise, it's just too easy to copy. And I'm sure it's different in different sports, but in that particular industry, that's sort of the
I think there's different ways of looking at it. I mean, so for a team or an athlete, the only way to keep anything secret is to not tell anyone, and then you show up for your event and the secret's out of the bag. But for a business, it's intellectual property. Secrecy is part of that to a point. And so it's not telling people, or telling people under an NDA, a non-disclosure type of agreement. And then the decision on patents, I think, you're right. You can look at it if you're not willing to wield the patent, then what's the use of having it? Although I think for a startup, that can be a slightly different calculus because you're trying to build assets. You're trying to build an intellectual property position that you can differentiate yourself in the market, right? Because if you do hit on something useful, like that athletes are going to want, then you're going to have followers. But can you create an intellectual property position that would allow you or maybe your acquirer to differentiate yourself? So whether you as a business will have the resources and the appetite to wield your patents isn't really the question. The question is, will the people I might want to sell my company or my investors, would they have the appetite for it? Or can I build some assets through trade secret, intellectual property, brand, trade dress, design patents, kind of a web of protection that is financeable and that somebody would be willing to pay money for, even if I don't see myself as having the resources to battle the big players. Maybe another big player would and would pay for that cudgel that I've built.
Yeah, and so that's why I think it's very much, which why I said I think it depends very much on which sport it is and what the arena is. And in that particular instance, the common practice was it's going to be copied. Only patent the things you're really
willing to go to bat for it.
But TaylorMade and Under Armour, they get patents. And they get them for good reason. They're in a competitive industry.
I do think that sometimes, though, there's a question of how confident are you in your own ability, however you define ability, and that sometimes you put something out there into the world, and then you see how other people use it, and I think it gets back to that sort of sense of having seen these things. Well, I know how you told me I'm supposed to use it, but that's not actually how I use it, and I find that it's beneficial in that way, and I think, sort of sharing something in a way that you use it, and then somebody takes it and does it in a different way, and then sort of having confidence in your own, innovation, your own discipline as an athlete, your own training, work ethic, to then take some innovation, like you sort of have the first step, and then you see someone else do the second step, and then you realize that can, having the confidence to say, I can then take a third step from that, and realizing, and sort of being able to play that, I guess, that chess match, and take the risk that, maybe they'll then play a fourth step, and I think, that's, I think, an internal calculus. It's a lot of that, how much confidence do you have in sort of, I think what, Benoit keeps saying, that ultimately the athlete has to perform. And I think, I'm, like my own policy sort of with stuff that I use is I always share because I'm interested to see, how other people use it. And then, I have to have that confidence in my own ability that, ultimately, it's not going to be this little thing where I'm relying on that advantage to win the race. I'm relying on myself, and I'd rather see if you can teach me something that I can then, use to greater advantage as well.
So if you discover that you really like using some tape, or something for the bike rate portion, you have no qualms about saying, hey, to your fellow competitors, hey, you should try this. This is really great.
Yeah, I mean, I think and some of it is, especially when you're a sponsored athlete, right? It's like,
that's part of your job.
You got to push that out. You got to push that out as well. And so, I mean, that can be, that's that tricky thing, or you think you find something that's really great, and the company's like, you find this company that's really great, and then you want them to support you, and it's like, well, they need to have customers, and so you think, yeah, but I want to keep this all for myself. And so, but that's not. And so I sort of view, like, especially industry, I'm in. It's okay. It can't be. There's nothing that when I sort of look at, I can't imagine anything that would be like, if I have this and no one else has this, I will win races. Everything is going to be something where, it's better for everyone if it's just sort of it's out there and this becomes widely adopted, and then I benefit from that. In some ways, it's sort of like whatever it is, I'd rather give up that advantage for sort of the financial security of being able to go do a training camp at altitude, or being able to go to a race venue a week early instead of 3 days early to make sure that I'm more familiar with the course. Then how do you measure that kind of stuff? And I think, for me, it's always, what can I do to get the most out of myself on race day, and all that other stuff. You share, both for learning and because, I think all of us athletes in general, I mean, the way we earn a living is by, participating in these sports that, have consumers, people that are sort of on the ground floor consuming. And in order for the sport to be viable in the long term, they need to sort of consume that stuff. It's no good for a golfer to win all these tournaments if people say, well, what driver did you use? Well, I can't tell you, and you can't buy it.
One last thought from Benoit.
I wanted to give another perspective of your protection of innovation. Just speed for me, speed of producing, of putting the product to market is the other way to protect your innovation. Because when you think about it, I read an article, IP, it's great, we're filing patent, it's one more hurdle for the competition to copy you, but if you think that that's going to protect you, to your points, good luck. They'll figure out a way around, they'll invent something, they'll come a little later, but it's just a little hurdle. I think a bigger hurdle really when you have to manufacture product. I read an article about Apple that spent like $500 million of buying machine with one supplier just to be able to do something on their phone. So imagine, I mean, when you have to spend large amount of capital, by the time you buy the equipment, you set up in factories, you train people to use them, and you monitor the quality of the product that you output. Guess what? When you can do that and it's an innovative product, now your competitor has to come, watch what you do, and copy that. How long they can duplicate that? A year, 2 years? So actually the speed of putting the innovation into the market, I think is a great factor for
I think there's a good balance. Like there's a challenge there is the speed, but then also making sure the quality is great. So there's a lot of instances, obviously, I'm sure this whole room can name millions of them, where people have just sped to market and then they get out there and they're like, oh man, it's not working or it's ineffective or so.
All right. we have to stop. We are out of time. I'm getting big zeros. So thank you to the panel. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Appreciate it.